A black Sharpie scratches across one page in the Oval Office, and 4 million barrels of crude per day quietly become legally untouchable. The man holding the pen is Donald Trump. The document is titled Declaring a National Energy Emergency. The text is shorter than the lease on a New York studio. There is no debate. There is no vote. There are no 535 senators and representatives in the room. They were not asked. And by the time the ink is dry, the global price of crude oil has already moved. Not because of supply, because of the signature itself. That document is Executive Order 14156. And what most people did not understand on that afternoon is that one man, alone, with one pen, can now legally cut a meaningful slice of the world's oil supply. No congressional approval, no public hearing, no 60-vote threshold. 48 hours and barrels start disappearing from the market. You think that sounds like a stretch. So did Congress for about 40 years, until they realized the law they had written in 1977 to constrain a president had quietly become the most powerful economic weapon on the planet, and the keys had been left in the ignition. In the next 12 minutes, you are going to see exactly which document Trump signs, what happens within 48 hours of him signing it, why 535 elected officials lost the right to vote on oil policy without ever voting it away, and the date that should keep you up at night. And it is not January 20, 2025. It is February 28, 2026. We will get there. Stay with me. Rewind. November 14, 1979. Tehran is on fire. 66 American hostages are sitting in cages on the wrong side of the world. Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia who spends his Sundays teaching Sunday school, has a problem. Iran is holding his citizens, and Iranian assets are sitting in US banks. He needs to freeze them, fast. But the law that lets him do that, the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, is a wartime statute, and the United States is not at war. So Carter reaches for something newer. A law passed 2 years earlier, in October 1977, by a Democratic Congress that thought it was limiting presidential power. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. A bill written, ironically, after Watergate, to make sure no future president could ever wield Nixon-style economic powers again. Carter signs Executive Order 12170. The hostages stay locked up for 444 days, but the IEEPA precedent is set. Here is what Congress did not see coming. The text of the law it had just passed allowed a president to, quote, investigate, regulate, or prohibit any transaction involving foreign property under U.S. jurisdiction, as long as he first declared a national emergency with respect to a foreign threat. That was the entire safeguard. The president declares the emergency. The president defines the threat. The president decides when it ends. Congress kept the right to vote it down, but only with a 2/3 majority in both chambers, an almost impossible math problem in modern Washington. 48 years later, here is the box score. 69 national emergencies declared under IEEPA since 1979. 69. 43 are still active in 2026. Congress has voted to terminate exactly 0 of them. 0. A peanut farmer signed a paper to freeze Iranian bank accounts in 1979, and 4 decades later, the same legal mechanism, same 5 letters, IEEPA, is the reason a single man in the Oval Office can move barrels of crude on a Tuesday afternoon. That is not a slip. That is a system. And the system has been bipartisan. Reagan used it, Clinton used it, Bush used it, Obama used it 22 times, Biden used it 19. Trump, as of April 2026, is at 31 and counting. But there is a part of this that almost no one explains correctly. IEEPA does not just freeze foreign bank accounts anymore. Over 4 decades, presidents quietly stretched the statute to cover entire economic sectors: oil refining, oil shipping, oil insurance. The cleanest legal academic read of where the law lands today is also the most uncomfortable. The only real limit on IEEPA is the president's willingness to use it. The legal limit and the political limit are the same line. There is no other. Now remember the refinery, Hengli Petrochemical in Dalian on the northeast coast of China. We will come back to it. And remember, Carter, because in 9 minutes you will see why everything Trump signed in 2025 was already legal in 1979, and why nobody around that president ever needed to ask permission. The oil market knew, the Treasury Department knew, Congress somehow kept forgetting. And the document Trump actually signs is shorter than this paragraph. We're going to read it. Open Federal Register, Volume 90, page 8433. The text of EO 14156 is right there. Anyone can read it. Almost nobody has. The order begins with a single sentence of legal authority. Quote, "By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, 2 laws, both passed by Congress, both signed decades ago, both still on the books. The President invokes them, and the lock opens." Then comes Section 1, the findings. Trump declares that the energy supply of the United States is precariously inadequate and intermittent. That single adjective, intermittent, is the legal hook, because the moment the president declares the supply intermittent, the Defense Production Act of 1950, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, IEEPA, the Naval Petroleum Reserves Production Act, all flip from dormant to live. They are weapons that exist on every president's desk, but they only fire when an emergency is declared. The signature is the firing pin. What does that actually mean in practice? 3 things, and they are not hypothetical. First mechanism. Within 48 hours of EO 14156, the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, adds 18 new entities to its specially designated nationals list: 8 Iranian shipping companies, 6 Chinese teapot refineries, 3 Russian-flagged tankers, 1 small insurance broker registered in Liberia. Each one was, on Monday, doing legal business with a U.S. counterpart. By Wednesday morning, anyone who continues that business risks being cut off from the dollar system. No court order, no advance notice. The list goes up at 9 a.m., effective immediately. This is what the trade lawyers at the firm Crowell Mooring later called the secondary tariff architecture. In March 2025, Trump explicitly threatened any country importing Venezuelan, Russian, or Iranian crude with a 25% tariff on every other product they sell to the US. Buy oil from Tehran, lose your access to the world's largest consumer market. The math is automatic. The decision is one man's. Second mechanism, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The U.S. Department of Energy, in its January 2025 statement, confirmed that EO 14156 reactivates the SPR's Emergency Drawdown Authority, the same authority Biden used to release 172 million barrels in 2022. In 2026, the SPR sits at roughly 410 million barrels, the lowest level since 1984. The president can drain it, fill it, freeze releases, or sell directly to allies, without a single committee hearing. Third mechanism, and this is the one the markets actually fear, the Defense Production Act. Most Americans associate the DPA with World War II, Roosevelt forcing General Motors to build tanks instead of cars. But on April 21, 2026, Trump invokes the DPA explicitly for oil, gas, and coal. The first time a wartime statute has been used in peacetime to direct entire energy supply chains. The DPA lets the president prioritize what gets refined, what gets shipped, where, and at what price. The Office of Management and Budget memo, dated April 22, 2026, estimated the executive could redirect up to 1.4 million barrels per day of refining capacity within 90 days. So now, line up the dominoes. One signature flips IEEPA on. IEEPA empowers OFAC to add foreign refiners to the sanctions list. The sanctions list cuts off dollar access. Without dollar access, Iranian, Russian, and Venezuelan crude cannot be insured, shipped, or settled in the global market. Roughly 4.5 million barrels per day sit in this category, the largest supply disruption threat the IEA has ever recorded. Bigger than the 1973 oil embargo, bigger than the Iranian Revolution. The market reaction was not subtle. On the first trading day after EO 14156, Brent crude opened up $4.18, hit $87 within 90 minutes, and closed at $84.50. By April 24, 2026, when Trump sanctioned Hengli Petrochemical in Dalian, that refinery flagged earlier, Brent jumped from $79 to $86 in a single session. Not because the barrels had stopped flowing yet, because the signal had been sent. The market does not need the supply to actually fall. It needs the man with the pen to look like he might. Hengli, by the way, processed roughly 600,000 barrels per day of Iranian crude. That single refinery in that one Chinese coastal city was buying enough Iranian oil to keep the entire Iranian government solvent, and Trump shut its US dollar access in an afternoon. But here's the part that makes most analysts uncomfortable. The pen lost, spectacularly, and it didn't matter. Iran's oil exports in 2025, despite maximum pressure 2.0, despite EO 14156, despite OFAC, despite the secondary tariff threat, those exports averaged 1.38 million barrels per day. At a conservative $70 per barrel, that is roughly $60 billion in revenue. $60 billion to a regime the United States declared an emergency about. $60 billion in the same year the most aggressive sanctions in modern American history were imposed. So the pen, as a literal blockade, failed, and the market does not care. That is the part the headlines miss. The market does not price the actual physical impact of EO 14156. The market prices the option that the next signature will work, because the next signature might. And the cost of being on the wrong side of that signature, for a refinery in Dalian, for an insurance underwriter in Singapore, for a tanker captain in Lagos, is total. You do not lose a percentage. You lose access to the dollar. You lose access to Lloyd's of London. You lose access to the SWIFT network that settles 90% of cross-border energy trades. In the modern oil market, the threat of sanctions is more powerful than the sanctions themselves. Iran got the oil out, but anyone with a balance sheet and a board of directors would not bet their company on doing what Iran did. Which means the price of crude is, increasingly, not about wells in Texas or fields in Saudi Arabia or pipelines in Russia. It is about the calendar of one man's signature, and in 2026, that calendar is full. Here is the date. February 28, 2026. That was the morning the U.S. Treasury, acting under EO 14156, formally rescinded the general license that had let Chevron continue pumping in Venezuela. One license, one revocation, 240,000 barrels per day, gone from the legal market. Brent moved $2.40 in 8 minutes. The Caracas government, which had been quietly counting on those Chevron dollars, lost roughly $1.8 billion in projected 2026 revenue overnight. Nicolas Maduro called it economic terrorism. The State Department called it Tuesday. And here is what almost no one in the financial press has connected. February 28, 2026 was also the day Trump quietly signaled to the OPEC Plus chair through back-channel meetings that any country replacing Venezuelan barrels with Iranian or Russian barrels would face the same secondary tariff treatment. He was not just cutting supply, he was instructing the global market on which barrels it was allowed to use as substitutes. That had never been done before. Not by Carter, not by Reagan, not by any of them. To make this concrete, walk into the office of a French refining executive. Call him Pierre, 58, 29 years at Total. On March 2, 2026, Pierre's risk team sends him a memo, 3 pages. The summary line reads, "All non-OFAC cleared crude carries elevated counterparty risk through Q4 2026. What that sentence means, in practice, is that Pierre's traders can no longer buy Russian Urals on a 5-year contract. They cannot model the risk past the next executive order. So they buy Brent, so they buy WTI, so they pay $4 to $8 more per barrel for the privilege of legal certainty. Multiply that across every refiner in Europe, then multiply it across every airline, every trucking fleet, every utility. Then look at your gas pump in Lyon or Marseille or Lille and ask why the price climbed 12 cents in March, even though the global supply, on paper, was unchanged. Because the supply is no longer set by geology, it is set by paperwork, and the paper has one author. The second order effect is the one think tanks at Rice and beyond have been flagging since January 2026. In a world where the US president can move 4.5 million barrels per day with a signature, every other oil-producing nation has a brutal incentive to either align tightly with Washington, Saudi Arabia's calculation in 2025, or build a parallel financial system that does not need the dollar. China and Russia are openly working on the second option. The Strait of Hormuz crisis in early 2026 was the first time Chinese tankers carrying Iranian crude were escorted by PLA Navy frigates. That was not a coincidence. That was Beijing reading EO 14156 and deciding to physically defend its supply chain from American pens. Which brings the story back to your wallet. If you live in France, in Germany, in Belgium, in Italy, if you fill up at a station that is downstream of any of this, you are not buying gasoline at the price the market sets. You are buying gasoline at the price that the next signature might set. Every futures contract has that political volatility baked in. The executive risk premium on Brent, purely the markup attributable to the threat of further sanctions, has been running between $9 and $14 per barrel through Q1 2026. That is your gas price. That is your heating bill. That is the cost of one man's pen. When the headlines talk about OPEC, when analysts argue about Saudi spare capacity, when the news spends a week on a pipeline rupture in Kazakhstan, keep one thing in mind. The single largest variable in the price of crude in 2026 is not under a desert, and it is not in a tanker. It is in a desk drawer in the West Wing, and it has been there, legally, since 1977. Carter found it, Reagan kept it, Obama used it 22 times without anyone in the European nightly news mentioning the law by name. And Trump, in his first 460 days back, has turned it into the most reliable instrument of price discovery the global oil market has ever seen. What does it actually take in 2026 for one man to move the global oil market? A pen, an empty calendar slot on a Tuesday afternoon, and a law from 1977 that 535 elected representatives have spent 48 years not voting on. That is the answer. That is the system Carter accidentally invented when he was trying to free his hostages, and that no Congress since has been willing to take back. The next vote that could meaningfully restrain IEEPA is scheduled for the fall of 2026. The last 12 attempts died in committee. The 13th is unlikely to look different. And while Washington argues, the next signature is being prepared. The rumor, two unnamed officials confirming, is that the target on the desk right now is a refinery you have never heard of, in a city you cannot pronounce, owned by a holding company that does not exist on most sanctions trackers. When that pen comes down, your gas price will move before the news ticker can spell the name. That is the system you are in. The oil Substack on the On the Radar newsletter walks through which refinery it likely is. Link in description.